In this example, we're going to create the commemorative wedding plaque you can see on the screen here. This will cover a number of useful techniques and tips and tricks that you can use. Firstly, we're going to look at setting up the 3D objects to create the dished area and ensuring that the parts are going to sit completely within that dish. Then we'll create the vectors for the text, bend them in order to fit the shape of the sign, and also distort the date text to fit the shape of the ring. Finally, we'll go in, calculate toolpaths on this, looking at how to machine a dished object, how to project a VCarve toolpath onto the 3D surface, and then finishing off with the ability to put the nice chamfered edge on the locator holes that you can see here, and also the outer edge of the part. This example could be completed in VCarve Desktop or Pro, and certainly within Vectric's Aspire software. In this case, for the purposes of the demonstration, I'm going to use VCarve Pro. Let's open a new copy of the software. Let's click on the icon to create a new file, and we're going to set up a job working in inches, which is 13 wide, 11 high, 3/4 of an inch thick, 0.75, Z0 off the top of the block, XY datum in the center. And then if we come down, because we're going to be working with 3D components in this job, we do need to check our modeling resolution setting. Now this resolution is something that can cause a bit of confusion, but really there's nothing too much to worry about. You can focus on a couple of simple rules that should ensure that you get the best results. What the resolution is indicating has nothing to do with your monitor resolution, your screen resolution. It's purely dictating how many points are going to be used inside the software to represent your 3D shapes. Everything within Aspire or VCarve is represented by a grid of points that we often refer to as pixels, and that's what we're indicating when we talk about the resolution here. Before we think about what setting we use for the resolution, the most important thing is how you set your job up. Firstly, your job size should be not much bigger than the part you actually plan to cut. So never set up a job that's say 48 by 96 if the job you actually plan to cut is only 12 by 18. Always set up the job just to be slightly bigger than your part, and also try and optimize your placement within the part to cover the most amount of space. So try not to have lots of dead white space in your design if you're working with 3D. The settings we have by default, if we click on the down arrow here, you can see a standard, high and very high. The more you use, the slower some calculations are going to take, so you just need to be aware of that. For the vast majority of parts, I'd recommend going with high or very high as being reasonable. If you did find that you could see some degradation of edge quality on your 3D jobs and you wanted to go to even higher settings but with a much bigger penalty for how much slower they'll be to calculate, then you can activate those by holding the Shift key down when you click on the button to create a new job, or when you click on the job setup icon once you've gone into the software itself. You can find out more about those settings by going to the FAQ section on the Vectric support website. Here we'll work with very high, which will give us nice, good quality 3D model, but as I say, some of the things like the toolpath calculations may slow down a little bit. Although for most modern PCs that won't really be that noticeable. So once we've got all our setup as we see here, we can hit the OK button. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, I am using VCarve Pro here, but this could also be completed in VCarve Desktop and certainly could be completed in Aspire as well. Biggest difference you'll see if you're an Aspire user is there'll be slightly less icons on the modeling tab. However, it'll still be easy for you to identify the same ones that you use in the Aspire itself. So if we come down to the modeling tab, first thing I want to do is start to organize my component tree. Within the component tree we have the concept of levels. I can use these to help me organize my parts, and we're really going to make good use of those in this example. So from the off, I'm going to right mouse click on this, go to rename level, and I'm going to call this first level dish, and then I'm going to come down to the clip art tab. I'm going to click on my clip art library here, and I'm going to go to the domes and dishes that are within the standard set of clip art that comes with VCarve and Aspire. There are a number that have been created at different angles here, so dome 30, 45, 60 and 90. In this case we're going to take dome 60, so I'm going to dome dish 60 rather. I'm going to double click on that and that will load that into the center of my job. Now if I click on the modeling tab again, you can see a component of that name has also been added to the current level as well. Let's go ahead and click on the page down key on the keyboard. Actually we'll go with page up rather than that, so that'll tile the windows left and right. We can also get to that by going to view tile windows vertical as well. Now I'd like to resize our dish, so I'm going to make sure that's selected. I'm going to go to the drawing tab, click on the icon here to size selected object, and I would like to unlink the X and Y and create a shape which is 9 inches across by 7 inches high. Hit apply on the keyboard and close, and you can see that's nicely distorted our dome in order to fit that shape. Now at the moment this is very high, and if we hover the cursor over it, at the very bottom of the screen there you can see it displays the XYZ value, and the Z value is the depth of the model wherever the point of the cursor is in the 3D view. So you can see it's almost 2 inches thick at the moment, this particular dome. The other thing we want to do is turn it into a dish, so we need to invert it. So if we go back to the modeling tab, I'm going to make sure the component's selected. I'm going to click on the wrench icon which displays the properties, and I'm going to change this so the shape height is 3/8 of an inch, 0.375, and if we leave that for a second it'll just update, or you can hit the space bar on the keyboard. The other thing I want to do is to set this to be a negative shape, so I'm going to click on the icon here to turn that combine mode to subtract. So now it's being taken away from any other components. At the moment there are no others, so we just end up with this kind of negative shape here. Now the software can't display negative edges because of the way it builds up the model from the pixels, which is why we've got this kind of vertical looking edge. But if we look at that from the side, we can see that's contained entirely below the 0 plane, so it is a negative shape. Now anytime I'm working with negative shapes like this, it's very important that I create a reference plane for the shape to sit on. This has two benefits to me. The lesser but still useful benefit is the fact it gives me a good visual reference and it will make more sense than what I'm looking at now. The most important benefit though is when I come to machine this, at the moment if I don't create that reference plane, then the tool has the potential to just eat in around the very top edge of that dish, and that's again to do with these pixels, these little squares that the model is made up from. So to create that reference plane, I'm going to close the properties form. I'm going to come up to model, and from the drop down menu I'm going to choose the option to add 0 plane. Now that will create a special component which is just a flat plane. You can see that's also been added here to the dish, and now we've got a negative shape being added to a flat plane, which gives us this nice reference that you can see on the screen here of the negative shape coming up to the edge. So before we added that, we effectively had nothing in effect around this. Now, although this plane is at 0 and therefore doesn't have any height or value, it still exists as a component, and so something we can reference when we machine. Now we're ready to create a new level, so I'm going to right mouse click on this level and choose the option to insert new level. I'll right mouse click again and go to rename, and we'll just call this one dish contents. So the first level contains the dish and our reference plane there, so that's effectively what everything else is going to sit inside of. So for the dish contents, I want to go back to the clip art tab, so I'm going to click on here, we'll go to objects and people, and if we just use the scroll bar and come down to the bottom, just make sure all those images have loaded, you'll see at the very bottom we have one which is a couple of interlocking wedding rings. Now again, I could double click on that to have it appear in the center, or we can click and drag it onto the 2D or 3D view as well. So if we click and drag it over here, we can drop that into the job there, and we can see exactly what that's going to look like. Currently that's selected in the 3D view and the 2D view, and in the 2D view we also get this nice two-dimensional grayscale which gives us an indication of where that's located. Now I do want to make sure this is in the center, so with that selected I'm going to come to the drawing tab, click on Align, Selected Objects and Align to Material and hit Close. We could have used the F9 key on the keyboard to do that as well. Now let's maximize the 3D view. What I'm going to do is just take advantage of the fact we can work in the 3D view now within VCarve and Aspire. So at the moment that object is selected. If we click on it again, we can go into transform mode. And what I want to do is just hold the Shift key down and come over the corner here and just drag in order to increase the size of that. And I want that object to be fairly close to the edge, so roughly around 7 inches width, and I like the way that looks. That's pretty close to the edge there. I think that's given me good definition. The next thing I want to do is adjust its height. So if we come to the modeling tab, what I want to do is make sure that's going to sit inside of my dish. So my dish is 3/8 of an inch deep. So if we go to the components, the component properties rather, and we'll set that to be, say, 3.37 of an inch and hit the space bar, and in theory that should sit within my dish. However, what I'm not allowing for there is that only the deepest part of the dish is 3/8 of an inch, and as this slopes up, of course the height is going to be reduced. So if we click and rotate this around, we can actually see there are portions of the model that are sticking out above the zero plane. Now I've got a couple of choices with that. I can either shrink the part down, or I could pick a different dish with a more pronounced edge. We could pick a dish with a flat bottom. So there are different ways that I could get that to sit completely within the dish. But what I want to show you here is a little bit more of an advanced concept that we can use to do this for us. Now one other good tip to show you at this point though is that sometimes visually it's not obvious that anything in a dish is sticking out above the edge, and that can cause you real problems when you come to machine it, because you'll end up with a lip around the edge of your part. Instead of having this nice transition here, you'd end up with a vertical edge around your dish. The way that we can check this for sure without having to check it visually is to click on the icon here to scale the Z height of the model. If I look at that, I can see the minimum Z of the dish is negative 0.375 inches, but the maximum height is nearly 1/8 of an inch, or over 1/8 of an inch, sticking out above that. So that's the problem area I've got at the moment, is that 1/8 of an inch. If the part was completely within the dish, then the maximum Z would be 0, the minimum Z would be the depth of the dish, and I know that that part is completely contained within the dish and below the zero plane and ready for machining at that point. So here we've got to cope with this 1/8 of an inch. I said we're going to use a more advanced technique than just shrinking it down or changing the shape of the dish. We're going to use the ability to multiply the components. It's quite a difficult concept to understand, but is something that you can just follow the steps that I'm going to show you now, and it would just work for you even if you don't totally figure out what's happening within the software itself. So in effect, we need to take those wedding rings and modify them in such a way that we just scale the edges down so that we know they'll fit within that dish. First thing we're going to need to do is change our order of components, because I want to take the wedding rings and change them before they combine with the dish. And because we work from the bottom up in the component tree list, these need to come down and become the bottom object. So I'm just going to drag that so it's just below dish, and now you can see that level and the component in it is below, and that's why this appears green now, because the software considers that to be sitting below the other components within the job. Next, I'm going to create a new level, so I'm going to right mouse click and insert a new level, and I'm going to change the name of this level, and we're going to call this multiply. Now what I want to take is a copy of the zero plane and the dome. So I'm going to select both of those components using the Shift key, right mouse click and duplicate. Software will automatically select that, which I'm just going to click and now drag down into the multiply level. So now I've got the exact same components in the multiply level as I have in the dish level. At the moment that just means I'm getting a double depth dish. So I'm going to switch off the dish level for a moment, and I'm also going to switch off the dish contents level for a second as well. And what I want to do is make this a modifying shape. So I'm actually going to change the dome dish component here, go to the properties, and I'm going to make it a positive shape. So I'm going to set it to add, and I'm going to set the shape height to be 1 inch. Now what's going to happen when I change this level that I've called multiply to have a multiply combine mode, the software will take the pixels from the component below it and it will multiply each of those pixels. So anything at 1 in the middle will remain at the same height. Anything going down towards the edge will be faded out until we get to 0, and anything outside of the dome will just be set back to 0 again. So I say this is quite a difficult concept to understand, but if you follow this process of adding in a level, duplicating the components from the first one here, changing this so that it's a 1 inch high dome, then this will work correctly. So say it's important now though that we change the combine mode for this level by right mouse clicking on it and change that to multiply. Now that disappears because at the moment we have nothing else switched on for it to multiply. If I switch on the one with the wedding rings in, that looks essentially the same as it did before. However, there's a subtle change because this multiplying level is switched on. If I switch this off, you can see that the edges of the wedding rings grow. And so if I just toggle that on and off and you look at the wedding rings, you could see what the multiply is doing is just fading those edges down based on this dome that goes from 1 in the middle to 0 at the edges. And that means now when we switch on the dish, that everything should sit within that because that modifying shape in the multiply is being used is the same shape as the dish but just changed in height, then it should give me the same fading effect as this is being raised up here. So if we look scale Z height of model, we should now see that maximum Z height is 0, minimum Z 0.375, and if we want to visually check that, we could look down the x-axis or the y-axis and see that no components are sticking out above the level of the plane. An interesting effect of the way we've set this up with the multiply component and the dish sitting above the object that's being modified is the fact that I can select that object and stretch it outside the area of the dish, and the multiply component will make sure that it blends down to 0 as it gets to that edge. Just to show you what I mean, if I want to select the rings here, I can't just click on them in the 3D view because that's going to select the dome from my top level here. So if I just double click in the background to deselect that, how I can pick them from the 3D view is to right mouse click over them. That gives me a list of all the components under the cursor. Now I can choose wedding rings, click on it again to go into transform mode. If I hold shift down and just stretch that so it comes past the edge of the dish, what we'll see if we just double click to deselect is that as that gets to the edge, the multiply is sending it back to 0, so those still fits within the dish. Now I may need to modify the height to make sure it doesn't stick up too far in the middle there, but essentially that's a very interesting effect that we've got, that I can overlap the edges of the dish there and the part will start to disappear. In this case that's not what I want to happen, so I'm going to go to edit and undo size. I could also hit Ctrl Z to do that. So now I like the way the model looks. I want to come back to the 2D view and create the vectors I'm going to use in order to machine the text on my design. So let's come up to the 2D view here. Let's go to the drawing tab and let's just click on the icon to zoom to fit. Now it looks a little bit like my 2D view has disappeared there. And what's happened is I've got a grayscale for the copy of the 0 plane I made. When I made my original 0 plane, the software created created a layer and put the grayscale on that so that it was switched off and didn't affect anything. But because my current layer was layer 1, when I duplicated that component, its grayscale was placed on layer 1. However, if I click on that and select it, and then right mouse click and say move to layer, and we'll move it to that 0 plane layer which is switched off, then that should disappear again. Now the other thing I might want to do with the grayscales is adjust their order. I want to be able to see the rings in the foreground so that I can create some text that's going to follow that shape. At the moment the dome is sitting in front of it because it was more recently created. If I select this, I can right mouse click and choose the option to move to back, and that will just send that to the back of all the other components, and now I can see the grayscale for the rings here. The order of the grayscales in the 2D view has absolutely no effect at all on what the part looks like in the 3D view. That is all controlled by the order of the objects in the component tree and their different combine modes. So it's purely for visualizing them in the 2D view and allowing you to select them. So let's go back to the 2D view there and onto the drawing tab again. Now I'd like to create a couple of elliptical vectors that are going to represent the inner and outer edges of the border of our sign. So I'm going to come over and click on the icon to draw an ellipse. I'm going to set the anchor point in the center, x0, y0. We'll make the width of this ellipse 9 and the height 7 and hit create. So that'll go around the middle there. Then I want to create another one. So again, I'm going to edit the width here. And for this one, I'm going to set it to be 12 and the height to be 10. We'll hit create and close. Let's create the text now. I'm going to click on the text icon and I'm going to type in the text. So I'm going to put Romeo and Juliet Montague and then the date of their wedding that didn't happen, 1st of April 1350. For the font, I'm going to select one from a company called Letterhead Fonts. These are prefixed by LHF in my font list here. So this one is called Parma, this particular font. So I say letterheadfonts.com, excellent source of really good quality fonts. Not a very low cost choice, but if you're a sign maker or even somebody that wants to do a really special piece of work, they have an excellent selection of fonts there. I'd highly recommend it. Obviously you may not have this font, so just pick something suitable that you have that you can use. For the text height here, I'm going to enter 1 inch and I'm just going to hit apply and close. Now I'd like to split this text up a little bit here, so I want to put Romeo and Juliet across the top, Montague across the bottom, and then the date is going to follow the shape of the ring here. So to separate text that you've created in the software, you can right mouse click on it and go break text block into lines. So now I've still got 3 text entities, but they're 3 separate lines. So if we just click and drag this up and out the way here, click and drag this down and out the way there, and then select this, and I'm actually going to resize that. So we'll go back to the font tool, set that to be 1/2 inch, apply and close. We'll just click and drag that up there for a second and come back to that in a moment. So now I'd like to fit the larger text so that it follows the curve of the middle ellipse. To do that, I need to split that curve into 2 so that I've got a top half and a bottom half. So let's click on the selection mode arrow. We'll select our vector there and come over and click on the icon to go into node editing. Now I can right mouse click with the cursor snapping to that node there and say cut vector, and you can see C is the shortcut key for that. So if I come over this side and just hover and hit C, then it's going to cut the vector there too, and now I've got 2 halves, a top and a bottom. So we'll just click back on the selection mode arrow there. I'm going to select the top half of that vector. I'm going to hold shift down and select my text. Click on the icon here to wrap text along a curve. I'm going to maintain the text size. At the moment we have it set to go above the curve, so let's just hit apply and see what we get. Now depending on the direction of the curve, you may get something unexpected, like this doesn't appear to be above the curve, but that's just to do with the direction that it's in. So the best thing to do is to hit apply, see what happens, and then make adjustments accordingly. So in this case I may just hit text on other side, so now that looks a little bit more like I'm expecting. It is above the curve, so that's right there. And all I want to do is create a little bit of an offset away from the vector, so we'll put in a value of 0.15. Also I think I'd like to space this lettering out a bit, so we'll go to text spacing and maybe turn that up about halfway, maybe a little bit too far, maybe just reduce that down a bit. Essentially you can keep playing with that until you like the way it looks. Now within the same tool I can select the bottom curve, shift and select the last name, Montague here, and hit apply again. Now that's okay at the moment, but it's the wrong way round, so I need to change that so that the text is on the other side, and this time say below curve, the offset distance is correct, and again all I may want to do is increase the spacing a little there. Now sometimes, depending on the vectors, you may not get the spacing to work the way you want it to, but that's okay. What we can do is hit apply and then close that, and instead we can manually space this out or kern the letters. To do that, with the text selected, I can come over and click on edit text spacing and curve. I put the cursor between the letters I want to space out, and I hold the shift key down and I press then in order to increase the space, and I can do that between any of the letters there and adjust accordingly until I like the way that looks. That looks good now, so we can go back and click on selection mode arrow to exit out of that mode. Now I want to distort the date text so that it follows the ring, and we'll be able to engrave that onto it. Now it's a little bit difficult for me to see the exact outline at the ring at the moment, so if I select that grayscale, you can see that's a lot clearer, but then if I select the text it goes back to being deselected. What I can do though is choose the grayscale, right mouse click and go to object properties, and I can choose how much it's faded when it's not selected. So if we go turn that up to sort of 10% and hit close, now it's much easier for me to see where the edge of that vector is. So let's zoom in here using the mouse wheel, just rolling that away from me. Now because I'm planning to distort this text, it will no longer act as a text entity, and I can see if I look closely I've got a few overlaps there that I really should fix up before we go ahead and edit it. So let's come over to the same tool we used just now, edit text spacing and curve, hold the shift key down and just click in between the letters there to space them out a bit more. And again I'm just going to sort of pick how much I want to adjust that spacing until I like the way it looks on the different combinations there. Okay, we'll go back to the selection arrow. Now I want to do the distortion, and the temptation is to start by rotating this so that it orients more so that it's flowing along the ring. And I do want to do that, but it's better that rather than me rotating it first, that I do all of that in the distortion tool. And the reason for that is that when I go into the distortion tool, so if we select that, click on the distort selected objects icon there and choose the bounding box option and hit apply, at that point the software builds the bounding box on it. If I'd rotated that around, the bounding box now would have stretched for sort of across the diagonals of that text, and now that would have made it much harder for me to edit in the way I'm going to now. So very important, if you're going to use the distortion tool, generally keep the text horizontal and go into the distortion tool first. Now I can go to the transform object mode in here, and we can do that rotation that we want so that we can orient that a little bit better towards the ring. Now when we go back to the edit envelope, you can see that that has rotated as well. Now we can hover over the bottom edge here, and I can hit B on the keyboard to go into a Bezier span, and the same with this one here. You may need to click into the 2D view to ensure your focus is on there. What I can do now is start to move these points around. So I'm going to grab these nodes, grabbing both nodes there to bend that down. This one I'm going to move up here and move this one down here. Bend those around there. And really this is just a case of trying to follow the curvature of the ring. And it may take a little while and a bit of adjustment until you like the way that this looks. So I'm not going to spend too much time here. Obviously you could keep tinkering with that as much as you wanted until you were completely content with the way that I was following it around. If we hit close now, let's just hit F in order to fit the view, and we can see how that text is going to follow roughly the shape of the ring to appear as if it's engraved onto it. So with our vectors and model complete, we're ready to go over to the toolpath side of the program and start calculating those. So let's click on the icon to switch to the toolpaths tab. Let's come up to view and tile the windows vertical so we can see the 2D view on the left and the 3D view on the right. Now the first thing we need to do is our material setup. So we're going to come up and click on the set button here. And if you are planning to cut this yourself, then it's very important that you recalculate all the toolpaths using parameters and settings that you know are safe and appropriate for your machine, the tooling that you have, and the material you plan to cut it in. So a key element in this job is this dish shape that we're machining. We're going to assume that we've got a flat piece of material, in which case I want to make sure that dish edge is pushed right to the top of the part. So we're going to set Z0 off the top of the block because that's our most important reference. Thickness of material 3/4 of an inch, that's fine. We can change the XY datum to the lower left if we wish. And then here where it says model position in material, very important that this gap above model is set to 0. That means the 3D components are pushed right to the top of our material. You can use the slider here as well and push that all the way up, or you can enter a value of 0 in here. All the other values look good, so I'm going to click on the OK button. Now we'll start by doing our 3D toolpaths, and typically we'd go ahead and create a roughing pass to remove the majority of the stock and allow us to go in with a nice small ball nose tool in order to finish it. When you're working with a dish though, particularly if it's a regular shaped dish like an ellipse or a circle, then we have the luxury of knowing that the toolpath is going to start on the top edge of that dish, and so take a very, very light cut to begin with because there'll be very little depth of cut. After that, you've just got the step over of the tool to cope with, and for a finished toolpath that's typically less than 10% of the tool diameter. As such, you're never really loading the tool up too high, so it may be that you can actually get away with not doing a roughing pass at all, and that's what I'm going to choose to do in this case. So I'm going to click on the icon here for the 3D finishing toolpath. Now I'm going to select a 1/8 diameter ball nose tool, so let's come up here and choose that from our tool database, and we can adjust the settings in here if we want, and again just make them appropriate to your particular setup. We'll go with a 10% step over, maybe we'll reduce that down slightly to 8% to get a really clean finish, and go ahead and hit OK. Now in this case I can't use the model boundary option because that machine's all the way to the edge of the visible components, and because of the 0 plane the edge of the visible components will be all the way to the edge of the part, and we definitely don't want to do that. We only want to 3D machine the area inside of the dish. So in this case we're going to use the inner vector boundary, but earlier on I divided that in two in order to fit the text on here. So at this point we'll probably need to make a quick edit, so if we close this, select those two vectors, then I can hit J on the keyboard to go to the join command. If we hit the join button and close and just unpin the drawing tab, now we've got a single closed vector there. Now we can select that, go back into the finishing, just reselect our 1/8 ball nose tool there again and hit OK. Choose selected vector for the machining limit boundary. Boundary offset is going to be 0. Because I'm cutting this dish, the center of the tool will come up to the edge of that boundary, and that's absolutely perfect for what I want to do in this case. I'm going to raster across my 3D part. We'll go with a 0-degree angle, and we'll just call this 3D finish and hit calculate. So the software just takes a quick moment there to calculate that toolpath for us. Can't see much from the 3D view, but we've automatically been put over into the preview toolpath form, so now we can preview the selected toolpath and we can make sure that we've got all the depth and definition and detail and quality that we want with that particular cut. So that looks good. The next thing I'm going to do is do my VCarving. So I'm going to start with VCarving the text around the outside here. So we'll select these two sets of vectors. I'm going to come over to the VCarve toolpath. Start depth is going to be the top of the material or 0. I'm going to select a 90-degree V-bit tool. Probably need quite a small one in this case, and I won't worry about the feeds and speeds. We'll hit OK on that. And if we wanted to now, we could use an option to use the vector start points. So what this will do is, rather than going to the deepest point on the vectors, it'll actually use the start points and potentially then almost kind of ramp down into the job. It's not the same as ramping exactly, but because it will still be part of the toolpath. But if we check that option and just see what happens, we'll also use a vector selection order and hit calculate. We can see there's the vector selection order. It's just going across in the order of the text, and if we zoom in on some of these, we should see that it's sort of starting on the top edge here. It's wherever the vector start points are. So if you really wanted to make sure that you were controlling that, then you would go in and you'd actually need to edit the vectors themselves and adjust where the start points. But in some situations they can both be beneficial choices to make. I'm going to rename this toolpath and just call this VCarve large text, and then we're in the preview form so we can preview the selected toolpath and we can see how that's going to look. Next, I'm going to close that. I'm going to go back into the VCarving toolpath. This time I want to VCarve this text here, but I want that to follow the shape of the ring. The way that we do that is we select the text there and we specify a start depth of 0. But then we come down to the bottom here and say that we want to project the toolpath onto the 3D model. What that's doing in effect is saying that the start depth is actually going to be the surface of the 3D model is 0, and then everything will be machined down from that surface. If we wanted to, we could adjust the tool. Maybe we'll go for a 60-degree V-bit because this is quite fine text, and we can say VCarve small text and hit calculate. And if we look at that, we can see that following the shape of the ring, and that becomes more apparent if we actually preview it and we see how that's going to look. So that's following the 3D surface of the ring in order to create the text for the date on our plaque. So if we close the preview toolpath form again, the next toolpath I want to create is to put a chamfer around the edge of our part. In addition, I'd like to actually chamfer down a couple of mounting holes that we might use to put screws or bolts on to attach our little plaque. So let's just come back over to the drawing tab for a second. Let's just maximize the 2D view and click the icon to fit that. And let's just create a circle, and I want that to go in the middle basically between these two ellipses. So I'm going to snap a line from this point to this point and then right mouse click in order to accept that and close the form, and that will give me a midpoint to snap to now. So I can click on the circle. We'll go with a 1/4 inch diameter circle, just come over here until it snaps and then click and right mouse click and select this line and hit delete. Now we can select our little circle there, can mirror that across the other side of the job, flip about job center checked, create mirrored copy and flip horizontal and close. Could have used the shortcut key Control-Shift-H to do that as well. Now we'll come back over to the toolpath tab. As I say, I want to profile around these to add a chamfer. So I'm going to select these 3 vectors, the 2 we just created and our outer ellipse. I'm going to click on the profile option. And what I want to do is use an angle tool. I'm going to use a 90-degree V-bit, and I'm going to use the fact I know that's 90 degrees in order to control my chamfer depth. So I'm going to set my cut depth to be larger than the chamfer I want to put on here. I want a chamfer that's 0.15 of an inch wide. So I'm going to set this to be 0.17 inch cut depth. Then I'm going to select my 90-degree V-bit tool. And then I'm going to say I want to cut on the outside of the part. Now if I just left that as is, then it's just going to move that tool out and I wouldn't end up chamfering the part. I'd just create a V cut on the outside of those shapes. What I want to do though is step that V shape in to create the chamfer, and I'm going to do that by putting in a negative allowance. Now as long as my cut depth is deeper than the size of the chamfer I want, I can just enter negative 0.15. What that will do is basically overcut that toolpath when we go round it, so that it ensures that the tool steps in by 0.15 of an inch, and that will keep the point of the tool outside of the vector but ensure that the 90 degree or the 45 degree edge cuts around it in order to give me a nice chamfered part. So I'm going to call this profile chamfer and calculate. If we have a quick look in the 2D view and I just switch on the solid preview, you can see how that's going to overcut. So that's overcutting by 0.15 of an inch there, and that's what's going to give me my chamfer. So I just make the depth of cut deeper than that and then use that negative allowance to step the tool in. Now if we look at that in practice, we can preview the selected toolpath, and this will really become apparent when we profile around this with our straight tool. So let's go ahead and hit close there, and we'll come back to the 2D view. We'll drill out the two holes for our mounting points, so we'll just say drill, we'll go to full depth, so Z equals, we'll use a 1/4 inch end mill, and we'll just say drill holes for that. Hit calculate and preview. So there you can see how the chamfer's worked on those small little holes there. And then finally we'll select the outer vector and we'll profile around this. Again, I'm going to type in Z equals to pick up the depth of the block. I'm going to select 1/4 inch end mill, hit OK, make sure we're cutting on the outside, 0 allowance offset in this case. Now I could add tabs, or another way I could hold this part in place even without a vacuum or a jig or other hold down method would be to put it onto a sacrifice sheet and then screw through from the back of that. So if maybe I screwed through here and here, then I've got nice thick material to screw into. I can hold the part in place, and so what I actually might want to do is, instead of adding the tabs and leaving the marks that they'll create, I could do a separate last pass. What this will do is come in and machine around the part with a slight offset away from the edge before stepping in for the last pass, giving me a full depth cut and a very clean, nice vertical edge on my part. So we'll put in a nice small allowance there, and we'll call this profile cutout, calculate, and we can preview that, and we don't see much because the allowance is very small there, but that would be a nice clean edge that was all cut in a single pass at the end there with my step in. To finish this, we could double click on the waste material to get rid of it, and we've got a part there. We could save that image, send it to the customer, get approval, machine it, and basically at this point in time we've finished what we're going to do in this particular tutorial. Let's just go ahead and save this now. So we'll click on File, Save As, and in the project folder we'll call this Dish 3D R and J, so that you know what we've got there, and we'll go ahead and hit save, and if you want you can open that file and take a look at it, or ideally you can work through the video and recreate it yourselves. So that concludes this example. Within this we've looked at a number of useful techniques and tips and tricks. You saw the right way to set up a dished object so that we have the zero plane both as a visual reference and also as a reference when we come to do the machining. We looked at how we can use the multiply effect with the different levels in order to taper down the edges of something and ensure that it will fit within a dish. We saw how we can use the set model height icon in order to check that something is completely contained within a negative shape. And then we went ahead and created a number of different vectors. We looked at how we can break text into blocks, how we can use the fit text to curves. We looked at the distortion tool for bending the text to fit onto the ring. Then when creating the toolpaths, we looked at how we can get away sometimes with just using a finishing toolpath on a dished object. We VCarved projecting onto the 3D surface. And then at the end there, we looked at a nice technique for chamfering the edge of an object before finally cutting our part out and using that ability to do the last pass allowance where we cut down the edge a little bit away from the part and then step in to finish it off. Thanks for watching this video.